Mediopolis, Chapter 6 The Show World and the Show Life. Sometimes the show mother watched back the highlights of her family shows. She watched them often, in fact. She only tended to watch them at great length when they were those that she was concerned about, or if she was particularly close to them and there was a good reason to, if she was living with them, or if she was particularly concerned for them, perhaps. There were distant family shows, of course, that she'd watch, but only rarely, occasionally. They'd entered the show world some years ago, many years ago in fact, but they had still been learning about it and getting used to it. Sure, in the old days they did have shows. They mostly watched other people in shows, of course, but they didn't really know about making their own shows, not that much, not that well. They were still learning in it now even, of course. Yes, many of her children were good at making the videos, cutting and splicing them, and editing them into a fictional story that made sense. Sometimes she even had them make up factual accounts when it was needed too. So they were good at splicing and putting together different recordings. They were good at editing. They all learned it at show schools now anyway. They had years ago. It was a different day years ago when she was born. She'd grown up when there were shows, of course. People were amateurs and experimental and trying out recordings of different people about them. They wore body cams and had cameras in their cars, of course. But they didn't really have it integrated, not penetrating all levels of society, not to that extent. Of course, it didn't penetrate all societies, and not all societies or people chose to enter into such a pervasive show world. No, but she had chosen the show world because it seemed to offer the family a ticket out, some sort of assurance, some security, some reassurance perhaps that she could look at the world and look at those people within her world that she knew. Especially she wanted to look at the children when she wasn't with them, when they were older, to see them around the childminders that would be visiting, or the aunts, or many other family. She felt that especially without the father present, because she didn't have him to watch them when she was there, or to watch the childminders too. So it felt safer, reassuring, to have the cameras there at the house. When other visitors were there, yes, people that she did trust and know very well, some that she'd known for many years, in fact, trusted very well like her own family. But even so, you could never be absolutely sure, not about anyone, could you? Couldn't even be absolutely sure about yourself, perhaps. And sure, some clumsy accidents did happen on occasion, that she'd see the various childminders or the nannies visiting, and they'd knock over a glass of hot tea or allow the toddler too close to something that shouldn't, or they'd be talking in a way that was just inappropriate to the older children, patronising perhaps, and the child hadn't wanted to say anything, or they were indulging them just too long in watching their funny stories and just not doing enough show cleaning. Well, whatever, it was easier to just watch back and see sometimes, especially if there'd been an argument sometimes. Usually it happened between the children. One accused the other of something, one person's word against the other. She had no idea what it was all about. Half a dozen of this and six of the other. All the children telling different stories, multiple stories, ones that contradicted, testimonies that said this, some that said the other. Well, she could at least look at the evidence and see the recordings. She could hear the audio recordings to know what had been said or shouted, and of course she could watch back to see what had led up to it, what actions, whose fist had gone in what direction, and who had thrown what to who. She was able to get a better understanding, at least, if she could watch and hear some of the times of the arguments when she couldn't be there herself, because she was out working, doing the home care visits, and in the earlier days she did dancing visits too, for the dance shows, and the care shows later too. When she was out doing her work shows, she really couldn't be at home, so there was the monitors there, and very good, the childminders themselves had access to look at the monitors themselves, so they could be in juggling many different rooms. If some of the children were okay, doing some studying, colouring in, watching a programme perhaps, or singing, engaged in some activity with each other, she could leave them quite happily to it to go to other rooms, and occasionally look in on the monitor that she'd carry with her, so it would also be useful for the childminder navigating the house with its multiple rooms. Well, she had 5 or 6 rooms for the variously aged different children, there being 12 or 13 that were adopted. Well, one of them was old enough to be considered a young adult now, perhaps. A very elder child, she still called him, though, and she still watched on him, but very rarely now. She often had her monitor up there in the room that she would glance at occasionally. though she very rarely looked at it, except for the younger children. There were only 2 of them left now, so she watched over them sometimes, just to see if they were stirring, or sometimes if they were perhaps not as into their studies as they'd seemed when they'd been left there by her or the childminder, and perhaps were doing something they shouldn't do. She would occasionally glance that, where they weren't focused on their studies any longer, where they seemed to be doing something bizarre, jumping on the bed or engaged in some bizarre game of some sort, where she'd have to intervene, tell them go back to their studies. But she had the childminders to watch over the monitors when she was away, so they used that when she was at work, doing the work shows. Often the mother did watch back over the highlights of the various family shows. The families themselves, as a collective, would gather together occasionally to watch the family highlights too, just some of the more memorable highlights. She didn't allow them to watch the lowlights, the times when she felt they'd let each other down, or let themselves down. No, she didn't want to expose them and humiliate them in front of each other. Those recordings she kept to discuss with them in a private discussion, on a 1-to-1, or 1-to-3, or 4, depending on if it was an argument that involved several of the children, and the childminder too, perhaps. Yes, she would use that evidence and the recordings of whatever had gone on, the arguments gone too far, the things shouted, blurted out that shouldn't have been. Even she herself had been caught out on many of the recordings, in fact, speaking too loud or taking it out on the wrong person, the wrong child, without realising who had really caused the arguments. Yes, sometimes the angry or the sad recordings they watched back in private with those that were concerned, those involved within the recordings that it concerned. They didn't use those for the public family showings when they were gathered together. Even the visiting grandparents, distant aunties sometimes that happened to be in the neighbourhood or visiting nearby would turn up, and they would sometimes share in watching some of the earlier highlights from the months earlier, perhaps, if they'd not seen them for a long time. It was useful for that. It was useful for catching up from distant relations too, those you'd lost contact with perhaps. It was nice to see a round robin sent, a video catch-up, just an hour or two, about what an acquaintance was up to over the course of the last few years. Well, you dip in and read a little, watch a little occasionally here and now, as you had time. If time permitted, of course. There were so many familial restraints, work restraints, and all the other personal restraints that she had to consider. So she only really watched the acquaintance shows occasionally. Really, it was just the family shows, and there were only a few family shows that she watched, really. There were a few of the grandfather ones that she watched very occasionally, and her grandmother's show, too. Well, she didn't upload that often, but it was nice just to see the occasional hour every few months, and a really good talk and a good laugh it was sometimes. She wishes she'd sent more videos more often, really. Perhaps she wasn't that used to doing it, really. The mother often watched back many of the highlights and the lowlights of the family show, even if it was just the highlights that she shared with the public watch. They would re-watch the shows as a family, of themselves, together, occasionally, if the circumstances dictated it. Often she watched the highlights of the friends that had passed away long ago, reminders of them, of those that had left. Legacy shows, as they called them. She was sent timely links, reminders about them, on websites that occurred on the anniversaries of their passing, or sometimes of their meetings. To think in the olden days, people couldn't even re-watch their own childhoods, couldn't look back over the mistakes that they'd made, couldn't look back and watch and re-enjoy all the happy occasions when they'd gotten to know each other, to re-watch their old romances, to re-watch their old families, to re-watch their old children even, to re-watch anything. How did anyone know anything about their pasts, except what people told them, except the stories that they could remember? Did they just rely on their infallible memories, or other people's memories, perhaps? The mother had wondered all this, sometimes looking at the older books, wondering how in the past people were so reliant on these books and stories without all the visuals, when they couldn't even see anything, couldn't see the costumes, the setting, the actual scenery, where they were, what they were wearing, how they looked, how they moved. Couldn't see any of those things in the past. How on earth did they imagine all these things just from some pictures and stories? It just seemed unthinkable to her to live in a world without such recordings, without such visuals. She was so used to being surrounded by visuals everywhere. Familiar visuals of her own family, of course, friendly visuals. Then, of course, the visuals of celebrities. She watched celebrity films often, celebrity actors, dancers, and the dancers. She especially loved the show dancers and watched lots of show dancing and show drama dancing and show science dancing too. All sorts of new shows. She'd never heard of half of them, but she was getting more into the dance shows. Very artistic dance shows she liked, but there was the down-to-earth soap opera dance shows she was really into. The dance shows that told a story. That's what she aimed for. She wanted to tell a story through dance and drama combined to a beautiful musical soundtrack. Well, sometimes it would have to be ugly, because life could be ugly sometimes. She watched loads of those story dance shows. They were becoming big and more popular too. Not that people lived in those ways, really, but they did to some extent, to a small way. For a few weeks they did, or they went on dance show weekends often, where they could keep up the exhilarating pace that the energy levels required of it all, no doubt. She wanted to get into something like a drama dance therapy school, something like that herself. A dance therapy show. Maybe a dance drama show, a dance drama therapy show. Who knows? She was looking into all those kind of shows, perhaps something to work towards in the future, if she could ever get the time to do it, of course. She was so much into caring for the family and having to go out working long hours. She didn't have the time anymore to put into the dance showing. She did watch many of the drama dance shows and the therapy dance shows, though she hadn't yet seen them combined as fully and integrated as she'd like to yet. But many of those shows were inspiring her, and she saw many celebrated dancers and actors within those in a new dramatic dancing performance that really enlivened and inspired her. But she had her doubts whether she could really go into it that much. Yeah, she was fairly good at dancing, but was she that good or that credible? And could she adapt to make it therapeutic, to make it something necessity and beneficial to others? Could it be something that she could do? She still had her doubts. She'd done the home care all right and visited many, and the show care was just something new that was taking off slowly. But combining that with the show dancers, yes, she loved the show dancers, the gentle exercises with the elderly show dancers, and even the younger show dancers that she just had fun joining in with in many of their choreographed dance routines, often just as an extra in the background or one of the peripheral characters. But still, it was earning a small credit. But could she combine the dance shows with the care shows? A dance care show? Yes, she saw others do it, but it just wasn't something she'd done, something too new, too strange for her. But that's why she was researching and watching many more of those shows, just to get an idea. Sometimes you had to watch lots of different things to get an idea of what you really wanted, because you never really knew what was out there, she thought. Too many more things out there than you could ever really know about. The more you looked, the more you saw. She was always discovering new genres of things. Well, today it was dance drama therapy shows. Tomorrow it could be something else. But she didn't have time to talk to people long about her thoughts on it. She didn't really have a careers advisor, she saw, feeling that she was too older anyway. The aunts she had to confide in had their own problems. They were older, they had their own relationship issues, physical health issues, mental health issues, social issues. They really couldn't get out that much. And when she visited them, she was so often talking about their own problems. And that was good. She was able to listen to them at length and occasionally to give advice. But there wasn't as much time to share her own problems and to talk as much with her own family about her own career problems, her own career doubts, and the type of job that she'd like to have gone into. She really was thinking more and more about the past and how she'd lived before the show dancing, before the show care and the show family that she'd moved into. Before all of that, what would it have been like to have lived without being able to show so much of yourself, without being able to see so much of your friends, family, acquaintances, and even well-known dancers, actors, musicians, doctors, anything, scientists, without being able to access all those things? To see video recordings of doctors talking on specific medical conditions that one of her children had, or to hear a theological talk about one of the questions that one of her children happened to ask as a result of the school shows. Who knows? But there were millions of shows that were at the tips of her fingertips now. There were billions of shows, perhaps, who knew how many, a vast number, more than she could ever imagine. All those many unimaginable amount of shows at her fingertips that never would have existed before. Before the age of the library, before any videos existed, no such things. She couldn't just watch a stranger give expert advice on a subject that she really needed to learn about. How to clean the house, how to mend something at home, how to counsel one of the children, how to speak to one of the childminders, how to relate to one of the aunt's problems that she had, any number of things that she could now go to a search engine, look up a very specified search for a very specified show, all about a specific concern that she might have. Yes, they didn't have exactly shows for absolutely every search and every need she ever had, but they did have an increasing amount of more shows that were relevant to her interests, her beliefs, and to her needs especially. She wonders sometimes, thinking how people coped without this show world in the past, without so many people showing and sharing so much about themselves. Were people more reliant on older things, older technologies, like reading and writing? Was it all about deciphering books? Or was it pictures? Were people reliant on primitive technologies, where they couldn't always see the person that they were reading things about? Where they were blindfolded reading sometimes, in the dark? Or maybe they just had pictures to look at, and they couldn't actually hear anyone talking. They could just look at the pictures, almost like a mime. Well, it was hard to know, but she had lived in a world when she didn't have access to filming people. It was hard to imagine in the past. You couldn't know what anyone was doing, not so easily, not in the immediate contact with them. All people in live stream towns or live stream houses, they are live streamed by the public. That means that all the cameras within that particular live stream show are all uploaded and are being watched by members of the public. It could be a few people, it could be a few hundred, thousand. Some shows were even live streamed by millions, tens of millions or hundreds. Live stream towns, whole live stream buildings, and there were live stream houses as well. Live stream, some people lived in live stream rooms, sometimes only as an experiment and for a short time, for a few hours or a few days, just as a trial to see how it went. But other people had lived weeks or months of their lives, or even many years, living in a live stream house show. That meant that anything you did within there could be accessed and then seen by the public as it was happening. There were also many live stream shows and live stream house shows that were also delayed in their recordings, so that anything that was deemed as offensive or illegal or wrong to show could then be edited out before the live stream aired. Sometimes there was a delay of a few minutes, sometimes even an hour or so the editors had a chance to make sure nothing illegal or nothing overly offensive was then broadcast. On the Mother's House shows, they didn't broadcast anything that caused any unnecessary harm. But it was hard sometimes with the editors. The editors would argue, and those were the family editors, they would argue over what was necessary harm, what was a necessary offence or not. It was deemed wrong for them to show anything that caused an unnecessary offence to any members of the public. But it was very hard to say and argue whether something absolutely did cause an offence to begin with, and whether it was in fact a necessary offence or not. So there was some disagreement between editors, but there was a lot of clear ground of things that were obviously incitement to hatred that was clearly wrong, as was anything that encouraged prejudice of any sort, any xenophobia that marginalised or demonised any groups of people or individuals of people even too. Anything that gave out knowingly false information or libelous wrong information too. Anything that gave out wrong information that could defame a character, that could destroy someone's reputation. Those on the family show that the mother happened to be part of, those were considered good reasons to edit something out. So there was a delay in the broadcast of their live streamed family shows that she was within. It didn't live stream absolutely live, there was that delay, just in case something offensive that wasn't unnecessary or something illegal was broadcast. To prevent it being broadcast, they then had a delay so that it could be edited out easily. Many people did choose to live stream for long or short times within such live stream house to see how it would go on. Often incidents could be viewed from multiple angles, of course, depending on where the cameras were. People often wore cameras, but there were many stationed in different parts of the room that could also zoom or be moved accordingly. Sound and visual recorders were in public places in what were called the live stream towns or live stream streets as well. There were live stream streets within the live stream towns. A live stream town was a small collective of live stream people who all had agreed within that area to live live streaming. Not that everything was captured all the time, but that anything could potentially be if the audio and the visual recorders picked up on it. And they did mostly in most places within that, the technology allowing. She couldn't imagine what happened in the world before street shows began. The road shows, park shows, garden shows, the school shows, prison shows, library shows, hospital shows, policing shows, festival shows, market shows, shopping shows, house shows, pub shows, cafe shows. There were just countless shows, all of the many shows that were everywhere in the show world. That was the live streaming show world. Well, there were too many countless shows to mention, and all the sports shows, art shows, business shows, political shows, religious shows, university shows, the studying shows. They just went on, and even woodland shows. There were those out in the woodland that were filming animals, or those that were filming people in the woodlands. Forest shows, mountain shows, adventurous shows, desert shows. The list of shows was countless and went on and on. Some people lived in show houses. Others were only partly show houses. Many were, and some preferred, private houses, although the existence of private houses and private rooms were known to the public, of course, if not what went on in the public live streams. Only the show people entering and exiting the private shows would know what went on in their private show, not the nature of what was on those shows themselves, of course. If a man and woman went into a private show, or whoever, they went into a private bedroom of a public house, then people might make some assumptions. Well, whatever. It was understood that people needed to have private shows for purposes of sexual relations, perhaps, and not public ones, by virtually everyone's consent. So a married couple visiting a private house or a private room, that was expected, of course. Many private people went to have private discussions in private rooms or private shows. People worried for them if they weren't going to a private room sometimes, if they were a married couple perhaps. Well, many people had their private visits and lived in private houses, and that was a choice. There was no law saying anyone had to live in a live stream house or in a public house. Of course, many unmarried couples also met in private quarters. Not without talk, perhaps, though. So people knew who was in a private talk with others, just not what the private talk was perhaps about, or what they were doing there in the private room. People might know that others lived in a private house, but they wouldn't know what they did in the private house, except what the people chose to show in a public show. They didn't know what would go on in the private homes. Many singletons had private homes, of course, or they turned off their live streams for most of the time and only live streamed their private rooms occasionally, whilst they slept or they thought or wrestled with their minds or did whatever they thought or wanted to alone. They could turn off the live stream whenever they wanted to. There were those that were allowed private sex shows to become public. There were those who allowed private sex shows to become public or gave permission for it. Yet many more kept such sexual shows private, whether a couple or if they ever did watch it themselves, who knew? Some kept the private videos, though, as evidence in case the other party might make some claims of something else that may have happened later on. So at least there was some evidence there to claim, to prove, to say what had happened in their encounter, whatever it be. Perhaps it was this, perhaps it was that. It would be one person showing against another showing. But if it was a live stream showing that was then saved to both their copies, then they would both have a copy and there would be no disputing it. But not everyone decided to go into a recording of such an intimate, private occasion. Some people thought it was a safeguard and had its purpose, and other people thought it was gratuitous and was exhibitionism almost, and too much to think of. So the private sex shows were perhaps evidence and useful to some people, whilst other people would choose never to use that, neither for evidence nor for something to enjoy watching either. Perhaps it was evidence that it was love to some, in case they consummated with someone that might deny that it was that later, claiming it to be something very different than what it really was. But did one really want to have a copy of that, just in case? Some did, but many didn't. Some claimed watching your own sexual performance could in fact be educational. There were many videos claiming such things, yet the majority claimed not to see a need for it, or didn't really have a fascination with watching themselves back having sex. But there were those that were interested in it, perhaps for education, curiosity, or if only for insurance policy. How did anyone cope, though, without any real evidence on anything else besides before, when there was such a shortage, a poverty of evidence in so many places, so many streets, houses, bedrooms, so many things that were never recorded, not even by the person living within it themselves? Was it just a case of many people's words against many other people's words, testimonies against other people's testimonies, a struggle between storytellers and narratives, without any live streaming, without nothing much to show, without perhaps just the limiting abstract artifact evidence or DNA evidence, but with no real cameras, no real serious amount of footage that would really show everything that had happened in so many other places? They didn't really show the live streaming of so many places in the past. Well, so many places just weren't seen and weren't known about, so much evidence didn't exist. There weren't live streaming cameras and live streaming towns and live streaming houses. They say live streaming cameras don't lie because they can be sent to multiple places and stored by multiple people at the same time. So then the original cannot be edited because multiple other people know about the original's existence. But some people have other theories on that. There are different theories on the live streaming and just how reliable it really is to live in live streaming houses, live streaming towns, and the few live streaming cities that emerged over the last few decades or so. Many years ago, there were great debates about that, and great concerns also that those could be edited by some, but great assurances by many of the great Mediopolis towns that had arisen, the live streaming towns that had assured so many people that because they were live streamed to multiple different places and groups of people, that they would all know of the original content, that it could never be altered, not by so many different people in so many different places at so many different times. But those assurances hadn't been accepted nor believed by everyone, and besides, other people had their caution and reserved judgment. They weren't sure about the idea of living in a live streaming house, never mind a live streaming village or town or Mediopolis, or a live streaming city, whatever it was. The whole idea of it, exposing oneself all the time to all embarrassing, shameful, sad, angry thoughts, things that you never would feel comfortable discussing with a close family, never mind strangers, and complete strangers seeing you. It seemed a ludicrous thought, never mind a goal to aim towards. Many people did have their doubts about it, but only visited experimentally to try it out, to see whether it could work in some limited ways, to see whether it would have some benefits if they could live stream in the town some of the time and live stream with the people some of the time, depending on when they felt it was necessary and beneficial to do so. The fact they could turn the live streaming on and off in some parts of the live stream towns meant that it was more accessible to many people to visit such places. The mother had been concerned, though, living in her live stream town. She was concerned for the eldest son. He went through a phase of watching death shows years ago, although on the doctor show, the psychiatrist said it was a natural enough curiosity. Since we do all pass on, we all die at some point, one way or another. And the psychiatrist had said the son's bereavement at losing many friends over the years to illnesses could have triggered an interest in death himself. So maybe that's why he was interested in the death shows, in just learning more about the dying process, because he was bereaved and grieving for many more friends that had passed on over the years. The doctor show had tried to explain to the grieving mother. The doctor show had prescribed support with many grieving shows for the son to see. And seeing the youth watching and listening to his death shows, or the dying shows, as some had called them, he hadn't seemed too frightened, nor too sad, nor even too happy at them. After that, that's what the psychiatrist had said anyway, so he didn't seem too concerned, because he wasn't too emotionally affected by it. They perhaps didn't make him that much better watching those death films, but they hadn't made him that much worse either, the psychiatrist show had told the mother when she'd taken him to visit. Of course, they were strangers' death shows. Strangers' death shows, or strange dying shows, not friends' shows, or family death shows. Those of his grandparents. She'd listened and watched with him when he was younger and able to understand and more curious. She hoped he wasn't still replaying the old grandfather's terrible incident when he'd suffered the heart attack. Sadly, he'd had to witness. She had had to too, like he used to see it before, and all the series of things leading up to it. She felt bad that it was him watching her father dying. That started it all. She had a nice edited video of grandfather's happier memories from over the years. His reunions, happy occasions with his wife and with her and the other children, and going out for a few days out, visiting work colleagues. Various happy occasions, having fun sometimes, laughing with the grandchildren. She hoped he would replay that video often, the legacy video, and he would remember the grandfather's life as well, not just the sad events that had led up to his death, and the death itself, of course, that he'd had the misfortune of seeing with her. She didn't want him just dwelling on that death he'd had to witness. Wasn't it awful, an awful thought, she had thought, calling her eldest son at his university campus rooms, an awful thought that children should have to witness death at all. Why should anyone? Disease, or arguments, or divorce, or any other number of things. She really wished the children had never had to witness any of those things. Sure, as they got older, they would have to, and they gradually had gotten used to seeing it more, and had talked to her and others in the family more about it. But at least they had the chance to look back at what really happened sometimes, rather than just constantly worrying and wondering what happened. When they were old enough, they'd get the opportunity to look back. When they were older, they'd get to look at other videos and other shows that they would then be allowed to look at. When they were then considered to be more qualified, to be more mature, more grown up to deal with the issues. You didn't have to miss out on seeing a serious issue that had occurred to the family because it had happened when you were too young. You could see it when you were older, when you were old enough to be able to watch it, to look back on the sad occasions, to understand what the other family members had gone through too, perhaps. Still, they were there to watch and view at an age when you were more older to understand, there waiting for you almost. And so it was good to have those videos as a reminder for older ages, for when people were mature and old enough to deal with the issues that they had happened when they were too young. It was good also to have it for people that were too far away, people that were travelling or working at the time and just too busy to know what was going on at the time so that you could communicate later. Like you'd follow someone's story, or many, yet you'd never know what happened to them in the end, not without the recordings of their last statements and what led up to their death. People then chose to leave some words behind, sometimes leaving some special words to different members of the family and also words to the public perhaps as well. There were many that didn't choose to as well, and that left nothing behind, and that you never know what they thought, perhaps about the family, perhaps about life. But there were many others that did choose to leave some recordings behind, personal recordings, personal relations, personal stories that they'd left for many friends, family, acquaintances, and they also gave public stories as well. You didn't even know if someone was dead perhaps in the past sometimes, or you didn't know what had led up to the death. You didn't know what they were thinking or feeling about in the weeks or months beforehand. No, you just heard it reported sometimes. It was a shock, and you just remembered when you happened to last see them or speak to them perhaps, or watch them even. But you didn't get to see or hear their reflections at the end for the last few hours or weeks or months perhaps. You just got to hear what someone else's story, someone who happened to just see them. But there were no actual recordings, not of the births, not of the deaths. So most people had trusted others, just relied on the stories of what they could or what they could remember of them. Or did they also just live with the not knowing and just speculating about what could have happened? What were they thinking at the end? And not really knowing what it was. Of course, she'd watched many birthday shows before her own birthday, and her children's too. Yes, it frightened her, but that was true with or without the shows, actually. It's a little reassuring to see and to hear others going through similar challenges to your own sometimes. Even if every birth is unique, it was still good watching other mothers' birthing videos beforehand and being in contact with them through video link as well. That was useful. Just as all lives and deaths are, many elderly or the sick watch those death shows too, or dying shows, as some more tactfully called them. Some people call them diseased or ill shows or elderly shows as well. Of course, many elderly people didn't have diseases or sickness and just watched other elderly shows. Shows about people suffering with sickness or disease or death sometimes even. Ultimately, they were useful and educational in a way, even if they were a little entertaining and a little fun sometimes and a little sad sometimes. Very sad for the families, of course. Ultimately, they could be help to preparing people for their own death, or for going into dealing with disease, or supporting other people with disease too, or supporting oneself through it. There were so many uses for sharing and trying to share useful information with each other. Wasn't that what we were all doing, somehow, trying to prepare ourselves for some ultimate climax or resolution to our own life shows, knowing that our own shows could progress into any number of things? Surely those people watching the disease shows were just trying to learn more about other people living with diseases, struggling with diseases similar to their own, perhaps. Looking back on your own life show, even with the edited versions of it, with just the important highlights and the lowlights, still that was so much. It was still hard to make sense of it all, though. It was so much of it. You could never expect anyone else to view so much of your own life, just perhaps some of the highlights and lowlights, perhaps, if they wanted to, if they were open to it, or if they were able to as well. Then there were other people's show lives too, to watch and to see and to absorb. They often made some sense, of course. Then again, sometimes they didn't too. Just trying to make some sense out of your own life seemed to be enough sometimes. Perhaps some family life shows and friends' life shows, even they could be a puzzle still to decode, even if you knew them well. Yes, you could relate to them sometimes very well, but still they could also be a puzzle sometimes and still be challenging in many ways. And then there were the stranger life shows. To fully understand those would take so much more effort. And did she have the time and energy to devote to that, with her own friends and family and acquaintances still, and the own work shows that she still needed? Stranger life shows did take a lot more energy, but they could sometimes be just as interesting, and there could be hidden things within it that you still needed to learn, and that actually were great. But who knew they were strangers? There could be any number of things in them, good and bad. The sheer amount of data stored is too incredible to comprehend. Vast numbers, amounts of films, stories are continuously uploaded, watched, viewed, downloaded, edited all of the time. Most shows have few to no viewers, though, of course. Many have hundreds, dozens, many more have thousands, and there are many popular ones also that have hundreds of thousands, many that have millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions, on rarer occasions, of course, that can become even popular. Many, many more shows than ever there were before. Perhaps even the accumulated number of shows in the archive shows could be billions, and current live streaming shows could be many millions of shows. No one ever knew the number, really. Vaster numbers than one could ever imagine. A great many, too many, are watched and listened to by too many too. Because of the sheer amount, the unknown amount of shows. Much of the footage of the shows was just empty streets, ordinary scenes, empty houses, empty rooms. Of course, those things wouldn't really need to be viewed anyway. The majority of shows never were viewed. Just the things where something happened to be happening in, and where a few viewers reported something and other people had gone to join in viewing, and it had increased from there. Many things were just only watched by a few people, or only those that were concerned by others and knew the people within it. There were many unwatched scenes and many unwatched shows that had little to no viewers ever, and there were those that just had a few viewers occasionally. And many viewers, and many, many thousands of shows, tens of thousands, that had hundreds of viewers. There were tens of thousands of shows that had tens of thousands of viewers too, and hundreds of thousands of shows that had hundreds of thousands of viewers. It was unknown how many there really were. There were millions and millions of shows out there, tens of millions perhaps. Who knew how many? But really, the tens of millions could be only watched by hundreds of thousands perhaps. Sometimes by millions as well, though. If they were very popular, they would be. The media went in search of people, but the media was a vast thing, though, because people were in search of people, of understanding each other much more. Whatever, by watching, by listening, by talking sometimes, by engaging more, by listening, by relating to people, by discussing with people, and debating sometimes too. It's not that everybody knows everybody, not like a global village, far from it. Just that everyone has the possibility of getting to know many more people. The public still gets to know the public to some extent, yet still only in public places. Everybody knows or could know what goes on in the public domain, in the live stream public places. And allowing people their own private homes with private shows allows any adult, young or old, to still have a private place. People can choose to make their own homes or places public or private, whether a small or large place, a small or large building. All people were allowed such choice in privacy or publicity. In fact, all members of the public had their private places too. So it universally had to be accepted, because forcing others to give up all their privacy without consent or a good reason would be an invitation also to all giving up everything and all becoming transparent suddenly, and everyone giving up all of their secrets to everyone. And no one would ever choose that, certainly not right away, not to everyone, not everywhere. It would mean living transparently everywhere to everyone, and no one would really choose that, even if perhaps some wanted it as the ultimate goal to work towards gradually. It may be a goal for some people, but it's not something that anyone has chosen to do, or that can do, or has done in the past. No one lives transparently and openly to everyone, not all the time, and not everywhere they go. But to have an increased amount of transparency, where people can share more and more of their time and their family and their professions and their beliefs and their behaviours. That seemed like a good realistic goal to go towards, but how far to go towards it was difficult to know. If we expected of others to live a totally transparent life, then wouldn't that be expected of us too also? So many people choose, perhaps, to have sex or to dress or to have intimate talks in a private place. Well, perhaps they too could take drugs in private, or swear in private, or declare their love for the world in private, or say their anger about the world in private, or say what really is so making them depressed about the world in private. Many people, all people perhaps, have their private thoughts, private dreams, private fears, private joys, and private hopes. We all have our private dreams, of course. How much we decide and where and when and how we make them public is a great decision and a choice that we should all make discerningly. Many others may choose to do this in a public show according to their choice, whether they would affect their ratings or their social reputations they would have to think about. If people were living alone and in a private house or on a private show, it could seem suspicious if they were always private all the time. Private decades, private families, private professions. Well, one would need to be a little public and share some things so that people get to know them. Otherwise, it could seem suspicious. If it was a longer time, people may visit out of concern. Perhaps they were just editing their life story, taking a longer time to do it, or trying to make sense of it all somehow. And not perhaps dead or dying, or perhaps as dead or dying as the outside world had feared it might be, or suffering from some great depression. Of course, younger children only lived in their parents' private houses until they were old enough to go public themselves during the adolescent years. That's when the great debates about how public one could be began then. You were on private all week, moaned the mother, having finally gotten through to her eldest son. The phone, that is, the video phone, had been ringing for a long time, and she stared at the image that he'd left there for her. She'd not been able to see his room show. No, not for a long time now. The eldest son was living away on the university campus, living away from the family show. She'd not seen the room show of his for a long time. Well, I've been thinking for a lot, the son answered. What, for all week? Said the mother. I was filming the dissertation. I still have a lot of editing to do on it all. Your life story needs editing, remarked the mother, having seen it recently and not been happy by what she saw there. Why? What's happened now? Asked the son. Well, it looks like it's just one big party up there at the great campus. What's your sister and aunties going to think? All those party shows. It seemed more like a strip show than a study show, said the mother. It was a mud wrestling sports show, a sports study show, actually, said the son. A drunken sports show, huh, said the mother. What would the young brothers think? She complains. Well, they're too young to view it. They'll see it when they're older, and they'll probably think that university is actually more exciting than they thought it was. We're studying the different mud nutrients. I bet you were, said the mother. When they're older, they'll think university's a place to muck about, said the mother. They'll think it's a place to have experimental fun, said the son, and not as boring as professor shows are. Oh, said the mother, if it's that boring, then why are you entertaining them always? Well, because I've got to, as part of the show, and it is interesting, but it's just frustrating, said the son. It's hard sometimes, being forensically studied. Well, said the mother on the video, looking closely at him now, trying to study the face that was on a close-up. You wanted to be a university sub, didn't you? You could have followed your father, factory sub, or found your own sub or something. Look, we're all subs of the university now, just not that well known. I thought you wanted to sub too, said the son. I haven't got a working sub. I've got to work subs. I can't study sub too, can I? And family sub too, said the mother angrily. They always need more mother subs though, at campus, said the son. With all my child subs, don't be ridiculous. And the work sub. At this, the video cut out momentarily, but then flickered back on. Swap subjects with Auntie. She's always offering, said the son. Like trying to make a sculpture? The video flickered some more and didn't seem to make sense. What's that? Said the mother. So you could spend a few nights a week at a university subject, I was trying to say. Oh, I could sub a few nights. What? I was saying you could spend a few nights a week as a university sub, and then you could get paid for it, only a small amount. I could sub a few nights, said the mother. Yes, they're looking for mother subs at the moment. Oh, I see. Sorry, I didn't understand or hear you. I could sub a few nights, she repeated back. Yes, said the son. Now the image was clearer, having broken up. She couldn't hear him sometimes. The sentences fell apart, and she couldn't understand what he's saying because the transmission had broken up, and sometimes the video flickered. Oh, I can hear you now then. You're saying I can sub a few nights, but I can't get away from work and the family that much. In any case, however much it pays, it only covers the expenses, doesn't it? Yes, said the son, but it does cover a little more than that, just for expenses, though. But if you could get the time away, get your auntie to cover, one of the sisters or something, he suggested to her. And he looked around himself, now being conscious of the room and all the discarded trash around him, strewn about his bed that he was sat on. Yeah, I could sub a few nights. Your aunt isn't so young anymore, said the mother. She can't see or watch half of what they're up to. Too quick for her. And she's too slow now. Too old, moaned the mother. Maybe slow them down. She has her picture stories. Could watch them on slow, suggested the son. Yes, that worked before, for a while. They only seem to speed them up more. After she's left, though, sang the mother, to the face on the screen that now she was zooming in on, closing up on. She didn't care about the rubbish around the bed, just wanted to see how he was, study his face, his posture more. Trying to hide the remains of last night's party, perhaps, having a close-up to the bed and not showing the rest of the room. Perhaps it was easier to read the face than to read the room and what he'd been doing in it. So the editings, they going okay? Asked the mother about the dissertation. Well, I haven't really got that far into it. Then what have you been doing? She persisted. Well, I have to collect a lot of the footage. There's so much of it to be cataloguing. It's taking a lot of time just to put bits together, find out what there is. How's that all going? She asked. Like trying to make a sculpture alien world or something from 1,000 tiny pieces. And I don't know what it's meant to look like, said the son. Why? Well, sounds interesting. I'll be interested to watch it when it's all finished, perhaps, said the mother. The image flickered again. She wanted to get out what she had to say, the invite, before the image flickered and went bad again. At least they were social subjects that he was living with, although she'd only met them for the first week, on delivering him to them. Some of my other subs, they've been watching you, said the son, not wanting to dwell on his lack of progress in the editings. Why shouldn't they? They're dancing subs, weren't they? Asked the mother. The older man sub, he wasn't, the son commented. People do have numbers, you know, not just titles, the mother said. I don't know his number. I only know the numbers of other subs I lived with, said the son, annoyed. I wasn't asking for it, protested the mother. I don't really care that much. We only met briefly, she said. Then after a pause, she asked, so he's a, neighbour sub or something? Class sub? She asked. Nay sub, said the son. I can find out the number, though. House sub knows him. Why? Said the mother. Is he interested in my dance shows? No, I don't know. I don't really know, said the son. Why are you asking all this? Will you just stop following my followers? Asked the mother, echoing the very same plea that her son had said to her on many previous occasions. Do I follow your followers? She asked the son. No, you get your friends to follow them, don't you? And follow your friends, said the son. Well, you and your aunt. Yeah, your aunt and uncle, began the mother. The line cut out briefly again. What's that? He said. The line picture was back on again. I was saying your aunt and uncle, they're the only ones that really follow you anymore. Hello, I'm here, he said. I got that. My aunt and uncle follow me. What aunt? Your aunt and uncle follow you. No one else does, said the mother. I can hear you. What aunt? Aunt Bethel and uncle. They're the only ones that follow you, said the mother. I'm only following a couple of friends. None of them are following your followers, though. Only following you and me, said the mother. All right, I was only joking, said the son. For goodness sake. So, said the mother after the outburst, are you hologramming us at the fam show next week, or will we have to see you in person? I'll try and get some time off, began the son. We could show shop together, or something if you want to, for the fall, said the mother, appealingly. I'll try to. It will be hard to have a long-distance mud wrestle, wouldn't it, without it, said the mother. And that was that. They had a casual chat, and he told her briefly about some of how the subjects were going before he agreed to the next visit in person and would visit at the family show. The motherly home carer had invited her elder male friend, the client, to the family home. There he could meet her family briefly. Her eldest son was also then visiting from the campus university, so it would be an opportunity for her son to talk to the older father figure, who might take an interest in some of the subjects that she didn't really understand that well, and he seemed to have some common interest in. However zany the old man may seem, she had to tolerate him, and he seemed nice enough so far. Since the application for several of the love shows, they had generated an interest, a small interest, and had gotten to know each other a little better. However small the interest was, inviting him into the family house had increased the ratings a little. She only hoped he wouldn't talk about any weird alien talk, alien shows, or alien people, or any of that rubbish alien talk. She had to make light of it around him when she visited him. Okay, it was okay making a joke about it, or talking about it around him, but not around the rest of the family or the visitors. She'd rather not, and hope not. He better not try and use her family airtime, pushing some alien beliefs, however much he might believe in it himself, not onto her family and their followers and friends. No, she wouldn't have her followers subjected to some strange man entertaining childish alien fantasies as a reality. But why should her more impressionable family and their followers have to be as diplomatic and tolerant as she was on her many visits to him in his world, in his show? The children were all busy asking questions to the returning, visiting eldest son about the live streams of his that they had viewed. Why had he drawn the outlines of mud people upon the apartment walls at the university campus halls of residence? They had asked of him, and he had said that he was recreating an older primitive media, a way of just translating to people. When people made pictures out of mud, he claimed, and mud statues, and mud prints on the wall. They laughed at the drawing mud pictures and the mud prints. And the mother had said that she hoped it all washed off okay, and the muddy films would all be cleaned up before next time. The children were annoyed. They were annoyed he hadn't seen their children's songs that they'd recently made, and not even some of the other earlier children's songs from over the last month. Or the other children's films, he hadn't watched those either. He'd not had time, he said, for the younger brother's shows, hadn't had time to follow anyone recently. Now he'd been busy having to follow other students at the university, follow other teachers and the teaching shows. He was having to follow the university guides, professional shows. He missed that fun spontaneity of the childish shows, of his brother's shows. He told them, hoping and agreeing to catch up with them all later. He promised that he would show more and watch more of their shows and view their more recent showings. They had agreed to link him and to show him the links to the shows, they thought the ones that he would like, so he didn't just scan the most watched ones that others saw. The mother, aware that none of the children had addressed the elder visitor yet, gave a little talk, a summary of each of the children, summing each up with a simple sentence, explaining who they were, what they did, what their strong points were, explaining how, why, and the older man made contact. The elderly man, after his speech, had thanked her and thanked the rest of the family for the invitation to the family show. There followed then a long pause, as if someone had forgotten their lines. Was I expected to say something more? Wondered the elder, having just given a brief account of who he was, what his former profession was, where he lived, that he lived alone, was single, told about how he met the mother, his relation to her. Was he expected to go into some greater detail, he wondered? The elder wondered this, and then there was this strange silence. Was it him, being the older man, expected to fill it, perhaps? Eventually, the elder had wondered for quite some time and was about to say something. He was studying then the son, looking at him, breaking the uncomfortable silence then. It was as if the mother, turning into the host and a presenter, had introduced them all, each in their turn, saying a brief summary of each of them, and then the elderly man also, like a narrator. Then she had returned to just being another one of the characters with them, establishing herself as the narrating character of the storyline then. None of them had questioned her, nor questioned her summaries of them. Neither had he. It was brief and it was accurate and relevant enough, even if it was matter of fact and a little too brief. But he hadn't thought to add to it much. It was as if she paused, expecting someone to say something, or him to. She wasn't really sure what it was, having never really been in the situation before. And he also felt a little resentful and doubtful about some of the things that she had said too, questioning some of what she had said, of whether it was relevant, of whether it was relevant to mention the profession that he was in, or his own conditions, in fact. Perhaps it was just that he was not used to her being in this position. None of the other children seemed to question her, since she was quite matter-of-fact and just listed people's occupations, what they generally did, and she did give a neutral account of each of the many children, the younger, the middle-aged, and the elder, as well as the elder visiting children, and the elder visitor too. She told what their most recent occupations were, really, and told them in a neutral account. Well, the elderly man didn't know any of the children at all well, had only just met them, and seen them briefly, hadn't the time to view their recent public showings, nor to dislike or like them. He still just didn't know them. They were a blank page then. Blank people before you. So he just didn't know. Sure, he knew of some of the children by sight and from the stories, the mother carer stories about them, from her many visits to him. So he never had the chance to question the truth of her many claims about them. He knew all of the children, and especially some of the older stories, from those stories themselves, and their showings. That might only show what they wanted him to see, and she might have only told him what she wanted him to know. He therefore wouldn't get to know, not having known them in dialogue, and certainly not in a trialogue, not yet, since it involved multiple participants. Since he began questioning the mother's story by asking the children to elaborate on what they had earlier been told, and reminded him, he wanted them to remind him too of what the mother had said, to recap and refresh it for him. He did appreciate the mother's efforts, although he felt it odd that each child didn't just introduce themselves. That seemed odd to him as a visitor. It was odd, wasn't it? Well, for the younger children, perhaps it was understandable. She might introduce them, yes. But why were the older children introduced by the mother too? Wasn't that a bit controlling, mollycoddling, a bit paternalistic? Why did she also introduce him and speak for him too? Then maybe she felt obliged to summarize all of them, including him and the older children, even the older son, and him, a stranger to the family, a visitor. Didn't even they allow strangers to introduce themselves? They had surely to introduce themselves because they knew themselves. Surely. He felt that it was a strange way to go about it. Yet even though he appreciated the gesture and their custom, he was an older man and didn't need the young woman's version of him being the first introduction that all the children would know of him to begin with. Was he one of her children or pet projects that she was working on? That he worried about, was unsure about. Now he was unsure about that, and what perhaps she had also said to the other children before he'd met them all. Your mum said that you're in the midst of a dissertation, said the elderly man, finally, stating it to the younger elder son, visiting from the campus. What's it all about? Asked the older man then, turning to the son, after then inquiring, after the brief pause, looking around, taking it on himself to become a questioner, inquiring about how often the subs, or the student substitutes, how often they were actually subbing. That was a term that he knew well. It meant that they were subordinating themselves to the subject matters that they had to study.